Why do we care about trees? Here's one reason that scientists think trees are important, and this is because of something called tree-mediated interactions. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means when two or more species in an ecosystem need trees in order to interact with each other. It turns out that lots of species need trees in order to do stuff like find food or reproduce. So here's how it works. Say we have these two animals, the acorn woodpecker and the Californian ground squirrel. Both of them depend on oak trees. The acorn woodpecker, well, they eat acorns. That's obvious. But the California ground squirrel, they don't eat acorns. They eat the grass that grows beneath the oak trees. So both of these animals depend on the oak trees, but in very different ways. And this wouldn't be possible if there weren't oak trees in their ecosystem. And what's even more interesting is that these two animals also compete for the resources that the oak trees provide. The acorn woodpeckers drill holes into the oak tree so they can store acorns in those holes. And if they drill a hole into an oak tree, that means that there isn't a place left for the ground squirrels to put their food. The same goes the other way around. If the ground squirrels dig their burrows near an oak tree, then the acorn woodpeckers are going to drill holes in those trees, because the ground squirrel holes destabilize the tree and could cause it to fall apart. The scientists who study this stuff call the relationship between the California ground squirrel and the acorn woodpecker a negative interaction, because the presence of one makes it harder for the other to get resources. But if either one of these animals disappeared from the ecosystem, the other would thrive. For example, when the number of acorn woodpeckers declined during a drought, the number of ground squirrels increased. So the point here is that these two species depend on the same resources, but they have a negative interaction with each other. And that dependency plus the negative interaction is what we mean by tree-mediated interactions. Now, this is just one example, but it turns out that a whole bunch of species have these kinds of relationships with trees. I mean, here's another example. These birds, the northern spotted owl and the barred owl, they both live in old-growth forests, which means they depend on big, old trees. But they also compete with each other for those resources. And since the northern spotted owl is endangered, scientists want to understand what factors help or hurt them. And part of understanding that comes down to understanding tree-mediated interactions. In this case, the barred owl outcompetes the northern spotted owl for the limited resources in old-growth forests. So if the barred owl went away, then the northern spotted owl would have more resources available to them, and they would likely thrive. And it's not always two species competing over the same resources. Sometimes it's a predator and its prey. Like these spiders, the ogre-faced spider and the zebra spider. They both build their webs on shrubs and small trees, but the zebra spider also eats the ogre-faced spider. So here the zebra spider depends on the trees to build its web, and also uses the trees to hunt down its prey. This is what we call a positive interaction. If you take away the trees, then neither of these spiders can survive. But the point here is that none of these interactions would exist without trees. And all of these examples are tree-mediated interactions, where the trees are essential for the species to interact with each other. But studying these interactions doesn't just teach us about the individual species and their relationships with each other. It can also tell us about the ecosystem as a whole, because ecosystems are made up of all the species living in an area, plus their environment. Studying how species interact helps us understand how energy moves through an ecosystem. You see, when an organism dies, energy flows from that organism to decomposers like fungi and bacteria, and how quickly that happens depends on the quality of the dead stuff. For example, if it's a really hot day, then proteins and fats break down super fast and energy flows quickly to the But if it's a really cold day, then those materials persist longer and energy doesn't flow as quickly. But there's another factor that can slow or speed up how quickly decomposers break down dead stuff. And that factor is how much woody debris there is around. You see, when stuff like branches and leaves and nuts decompose, they release carbon into the soil. But when you have lots of woody debris around, those materials don't break down as easily, and so they trap carbon instead of releasing it. Scientists call this carbon storage, and that's one of the many ways that trees help fight the climate crisis. But the amount of carbon stored in dead stuff depends on how long that stuff persists in the ecosystem, which depends on how quickly decomposers break it down, which depends on those temperature and moisture conditions. So studying how fast dead stuff breaks down in different ecosystems helps scientists better predict how much carbon will be stored there. And this is where tree-mediated interactions come back around, because the type of forest you have affects how fast things decompose. In a coniferous forest, for example, needles fall off the trees and sit on the forest floor, and those needles decompose pretty quickly because they're full of nitrogen. But in a deciduous forest, the leaves fall off the trees, and those leaves decompose as quickly because they're full of cellulose. So if scientists want to understand how much carbon is stored in a forest, they have to know what kind of forest it is, and how the types of trees affect the decomposition rates of the forest floor. and that's just one example. There are tons of ways that trees affect decomposition in an ecosystem. For example, the thick bark of some trees makes it hard for decomposers to break them down, which means that the nutrients trapped inside those trees persist for a long time. And on top of that, trees produce chemicals that can either help or hurt So by studying how fast decomposers break down dead stuff, scientists learn more about how energy moves through an ecosystem. And by studying tree-mediated interactions, scientists learn more about how all the pieces of an ecosystem fit together. And ultimately, that knowledge can help them answer some big questions. Like if the world gets warmer, what will happen to all the pieces of an ecosystem, and how will they interact with each other? Or if a forest suffers from a pest infestation, how will that affect the species that depend on the trees? Answering questions like these requires understanding how the parts of an ecosystem fit together and interact with each other. And while scientists have been studying these types of interactions for decades, they need your help to keep learning more. That's because most studies like these are done in places with lots of trees like forests. But there aren't very many forests in the world compared to other ecosystems like deserts. And we've learned a lot from studying tree-mediated interactions in forests. But there's a lot that we don't know, especially when it comes to deserts. Deserts cover 20% of Earth's land area, and they're home to tons of unique species. But there's just been a lot less research done on desert ecosystems than on forests. There are all sorts of reasons for that. For example, deserts are harsh environments, which makes it harder to study them. And there are fewer people living in deserts, which means there are fewer scientists living nearby who can study the ecosystems. But despite how challenging they are to study, deserts are an important ecosystem, not only because of how many species they're home to, but also because they're expected to grow as the planet warms. And as the deserts grow, the species living there will face new challenges. For example, there will be even bigger wildfires in deserts, which will kill off all the plants and animals in the area. And studying how the species interact with each other can help scientists predict how they might respond to changes like these. But in order to study those interactions, we need your help. So let's say you want to study the desert kangaroo rat, which lives in the Sonoran Desert in the southwestern United States and Mexico. These little guys depend on the creosote. They eat the seeds inside the creosote bush and use the plant's deep root system to hide from predators. Plus, the creosote bush has a negative interaction with another plant called the bat's ears. When the creosote bush grows too tall, its shade kills off the bat's ears. And if the bat's ears grow too tall, their flowers get pollinated by bees, which takes away the bees that the creosote bush needs to set fruit. So if you want to study the relationship between the desert kangaroo rat and the creosote bush, you'll need to first figure out what variables might affect their interactions, like maybe temperature or rainfall. Then you need to collect data on how much those variables change over time. Then once you have all of that data, you can start to draw conclusions. Maybe you'll find that, during times of drought, the creosote bush produces fewer seeds, which means that the kangaroo rats have fewer seeds to eat. And these are the kinds of insights that can help scientists understand how the desert ecosystem works and how it might change in the future. But in order to do this work, we need your help. Thanks for helping us answer these scientific questions. Now check out this video where you can learn how trees help fight the climate crisis.